Chapter 10. A Warm Welcome. The day grew lighter and warmer as they floated along. After a while, the river rounded a steep shoulder of land that came down upon their left. Under its rocky feet, like an inland cliff, the deepest stream had flowed lapping and bubbling. Suddenly the cliff fell away, the shore sank, the trees ended. Then Bilbo saw a sight. The lands opened wide about him, filled with the waters of the river, which broke up and wandered in 100 winding courses, or halted in marshes and pools dotted with isles on every side. But still a strong water flowed on steadily through the mists, and far away, in its dark head in a torn cloud, there loomed the mountain. And its nearest neighbors to the northeast and tumbled lands that joined it to them could not be seen. All alone it rose, and looked across the marshes to the forest, the lonely mountain. Bilbo had come far, and though many adventurers to see it, and now he did not like the look of it in the least. As he listened to the talk of the raftmen and pieced together the scraps of information they let fall, he soon realized that he was very fortunate ever to have seen it at all, even from a distance. Dreary as had been his imprisonment and unpleasant was his position, to say nothing of the poor dwarves underneath him, still, he had been more lucky than he had guessed. The talk was all of trade that came and went on the waterways, and the growth of the traffic went on the river, as roads out of the east towards Mirkwood vanished or fell into disuse, and of the bickerings of lakemen and the wood elves about the upkeep of the forest river and care of the banks. Those lands had changed much since the days when the dwarves were dwelt in the mountain, days which most people now remember only a very shadowy tradition. They had changed even in recent years, and since the last news of Gandalf had of them. Great floods and rains had swollen the waters that flowed to the east, and there had been an earthquake or two, which some were inclined to attribute to the dragon, alluding to him chiefly with a curse and an ominous nod in the direction of the mountain. The marshes and bogs had spread wider and wider on either side. Paths had vanished, and many a rider wanderer too, if they tried to find the lost ways across. The elf-road to the wood which the dwarves had followed on the advice of Beorn now came to a doubtful and little-used end on the eastern edge of the forest. Only the river offered any longer a safe way from the skirts of Mirkwood in the north mountain-shadowed plains beyond, and the river was guarded by the Wood King's elves. So, you see, Bilbo had come, in the end, by the only road that was any good. It may have been some comfort to Mr. Baggins shuffling on the barrels, if he only had known the news of this had reached Gandalf far away, and given him great anxiety. In fact, that he was finishing his other business, which does not come into this tale, and getting ready to come in search of Thorin's company, but Bilbo did not know it. All he knew was the river seemed to go on and on and on forever, and he was hungry. There was a nasty cold in his nose, and he did not like the way the mountain seems to frown at him and threaten him as it drew ever near. After a while, however, the river took a more southerly course, and the mountain receded again, and at last, late in the day, the shores grew rocky, and the river gathered all its wandering waters together in a deep and rapid flood, and they swept along at a great speed. The sun had set when, turning with another steep towards the east, the forest river rushed into the long lake. There it had a wide mouth with many stony, cliff-like gates on either side, whose feet were piled with shingles. The long lake. Bilbo had never imagined that any water that was not the sea could be so big. It was so wide that the opposite shores looked small and far, but it was so long that its northerly end, which pointed to the mountain, could not be seen at all. Only from the map did Bilbo know that way up there, where the stars of the Wain were already twinkling, The running river came down into the lake from the dale, and with the forest river filled with deep waters, must once have been a great, deep, rocky valley. At the southern end, the doubled waters poured out again over high waterfalls and ran hurriedly into unknown lands. In the still evening air, the noise of the falls could be heard like a distant roar. Not far from the mouth of the forest river was the strange town he heard the elves speak of in the king's cellars. It was not built on the shore, though there were a few huts and buildings there, but right out on the surface of the lake, protected by the swirl of entering river by a promontory of rock which formed a calm bay. A great bridge made of wood, made out to where the huge piles of forest trees, was built a busy wooden town, not a town of elves, but of men, who still dared to dwell there under the shadow of the distant Dragon Mountain. There they still throve on the trade that came up the great river from the south, and was carted past the falls to their town. But in the great days of old, when Dale in the north was rich and prosperous, they had been wealthy and powerful, and there had been fleets of boats in the water, and some were filled with gold and some with warriors in armor. There had been wars and deeds in which were now only a legend. The rotting piles of a greater town could still be seen along the shores where the waters sank in drought. But men remembered little of all that, and though some still sang old songs of the dwarf kings of the mountain, Thror and Thrain of the race of Durin, and of the coming of the dragon and the fall of the lords of Dale, some sang too that Thror and Thrain would come back one day and gold would flow into the rivers through the mountain gates, and all the land would be filled with new song and new laughter. But this pleasant legend did not affect their daily business. As soon as the riffraff of barrels came in sight, the boats rowed out from the piles of the town, and voices hailed the raft steerers. Then ropes were cast and oars were pulled, and soon the raft was drawn out of the current of the forest river and towed round the way of the high shoulder of rock into the little bay of Lake Town. There would be moored not far from the shoreway at the head of the great bridge. Soon men would come up from the south and take some of the casks away. Others would be filled with goods that had brought to be taken back up the stream to the wood elves' home. In the meanwhile, the barrels were left to afloat while the elves, the raft, and the boatmen went to feast in Lake Town. They would have been surprised if they had seen what happened down by the shore after they had all gone and the shade of night had fallen. First of all, a barrel was cut loose by Bilbo and pushed to the shore and open. Groans came from inside, and out crept a most unhappy dwarf. Wet straw was in his draggled beard, and he was so sore and stiff and so bruised and buffeted he could hardly stand or stumble through the shallow water to lie groaning on the shore. He had a famished and savage look like a dog that had been chained and forgotten in a kennel for a week. It was Thorin, but you could only have told by his golden chain, and the color of his now dirty and tattered sky-blue hood with its tarnished silver tassel. It was some time before he was even begin to be polite to Bilbo. "Well, are you alive or are you dead?" asked Bilbo quite crossly. Perhaps he had forgotten that he had had at least one good meal more than the dwarves, and also the use of his arms and legs, not to speak of the greater allowance of air. "Are you still in prison or are you free? If you want food, and if you want to go on with this silly adventure, it's yours after all and not mine. You better stop your arms and rub your legs and try and help me get the others out while there's still a chance." Thorin of Sol saw the sense in this, so after a few more groans he got up and helped the hobbit as best he could. In the darkness, floundering in the cold water, they had a difficult and nasty job finding which were the right barrels. Knocking outside and calling only discovered about 6 dwarves that could answer. These were unpacked and helped ashore, where they sat or lay muttering and moaning. They were so soaked and bruised and cramped they could hardly yet realize their release or be properly thankful for it. Dwalin and Balin were 2 of the most unhappy, and it was no good asking for them help. Bifur and Bofur were less knocked about and drier, but they laid down and would do nothing. Fili and Kili, however, who were young, for dwarves, and had also been packed more neatly with plenty of straw into smaller casks, came out more or less smiling, with only a bruise or two and a stiffness that soon wore off. "I hope I never have to smell the smell of apples again," said Fili. "My tub was full of it. To smell apples everlastingly when you can scarcely move and are cold and sick with hunger is maddening. I could eat anything in the whole wide world now for hours and hours on end, but not an apple." With the willing help of Fili and Kili, Thorin and Bilbo had at last discovered the remainder of the company and got them out. Poor fat Bombar was asleep or senseless. Dori, Nori, Ori, Owen, and Glóin were waterlogged and seemed only half alive. They had to be carried up one by one and laid helplessly on the shore. "Well, there we are," said Thorin. "And I suppose we ought to thank our stars and Mr. Baggins. I am sure he has a right to expect it, though I wish he had been arranged a more comfortable journey. Still, all is very much at your service once more, Mr. Baggins. No doubt we shall feel properly grateful when we are fed and recovered. In the meantime, what's next?" "I suggest Lake Town," said Bilbo. What else is there?" "Nothing else good, of course," he suggested. So leaving the others, Thorin and Fili and Kili and the Hobbit went along to the shore to the great bridge. There were guards at the head of it, but they were not keeping very careful watch, for it was so long since there had been any real need. Except for the occasional squabbles about river tolls, they were friends of the wood elves. Other folk were far away, and some of the younger people in the town openly doubted the existence of any dragon in the mountain, and laughed at the greybeards and gammers who said they had seen him flying in the sky in their younger days. That being so, it is not surprising the dwarves were drinking and laughing by a fire in their hut, and did not hear the noise of the unpacking of the dwarves or the footsteps of the 4 scouts. Their astonishment was enormous when Thorin Oakenshield stopped in through their door. Who are you and what do you want?" they shouted, leaping to their feet and groping for weapons. "Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror, king under the mountain," said the dwarf in a loud voice, and he looked it, in spite of his torn clothes and dragged hood, the gold gleaming on his neck and his waist, his eyes dark and deep. "I have come back. I wish to see the mountain master of your town." Then there was tremendous excitement. Some of the more foolish ran out of the hut as if they expected the mountain to go golden in the night, and all the waters of the lake turn yellow right away. The captain of the guard came forward. "And who are those?" he asked, pointing to Fili and Kili and Bilbo. "The sons of my father's daughter," answered Thorin. "Fili and Kili of the race of Durin, and Mr. Baggins, who has travelled with us out of the west." "If you come in peace, lay down your arms," said the captain. "We have none," said Thorin. It was true enough. Their knives had been taken by the wood elves, and the great sword Orcus too. Bilbo had a short sword, hidden as usual, but he said nothing about it. "We have no need of weapons. We who return at last to our own spoken of old, nor could we fight against so many. Take us to your master." "He is at a feast," said the captain. "Then all the more reason for taking us to him," burst in Fili, who was getting impatient at the solemnities. "We are worn out and famished after our long road, and we have sick comrades. Now make haste, and let's have no more words, or your master might have something to say to you." "Follow me then," said the captain. With 6 men about them, he led them over the bridge and through the gates into the marketplace of the town. There was a wide circle of quiet water surrounded by tall piles on which were built the greater houses, and by long wooden quays and many steps and ladders going down to the surface of the lake. From one great hall shone many lights, and there came the sound of many voices. They passed its doors and stood blinking in the light, looking at the long tables filled with folk. "I am Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror, king of the mountain. I return said Thorin, in a loud voice from the door, before the captain could say anything. All leaped to their feet. The master of the town sprang from his great chair, but none rose in greater surprise than the raftmen of the elves, who were sitting in the lower end of the hall. Pressing forward before the master's table, they cried, "They are the prisoners of our king that have escaped, wandering vagabond dwarves that could not give any account of themselves, sneaking into the woods and molesting our people." "Is this true?" said the master. As a matter of fact, he thought it more likely than the return of the king of the mountain, if any such person ever really existed. "It is true that we were wrongfully waylaid by the elven king and imprisoned without cause as we journeyed back to our land," said Thorin. "But lock nor bane may hinder the homecoming spoken of old, nor is this town in the wood elves' realm. I would speak to the master of the town of the men of the lake, not the raftmen of the king." Then the master hesitated and looked from one to the other. The elven king was powerful in these parts. The master wished for no enmity with him, nor did he think much of old songs, giving his mind to trade and tolls, to cargoes and gold, to which habit he owed his position. Others were of different mind, however, and quickly the matters were settled without him. The news had been spread from door to door of the hall like fire throughout all the town. People were shouting inside the hall and outside of it. The quays were thronged and with hurried feet. Some began to sing snatches of old songs concerning the return of the king unto the mountain. That it was Thor's grandson, not Thor himself, that had come back, did not bother them at all. Others took up the songs that rolled loud and high over the lake. "The king beneath the mountains, the king of carven stone, the lord of silver fountains, shall come into his own. His crown shall be upholden, his harp shall be restrung, his halls shall echo golden, the songs of yore resung. The wood shall wave on mountains, and grass beneath the sun, his wealth shall flow on fountains, and golden rivers run. The streams shall run in gladness, the lake shall shine and burn, all sorrow fail and sadness at the mountain king's return." So they sang, very like that. Only once there was a great deal more of it, and there was much shouting as well as music of harps and of fiddles mixed in with it. Indeed, there was not much excitement not known in the town in the memory of the oldest grandfather. The wood themselves began to wonder greatly, and even be afraid. They did not know, of course, how Thor had escaped, and began to think that their king might have made a serious mistake. As for the master, he saw there was nothing for it but to obey the general clamor, at that moment at any rate, and pretended to believe that Thorin was what he said. So he gave up to him his own great chair, and sat Fili and Kili beside him in places of honor. Even Bilbo was given a seat at the high table, though no explanation of where he came in. No songs alluded to him, even in the most obscurest way, and was asked for in the general bustle. Soon afterwards, the dwarves were brought into the town amid signs of astounding enthusiasm. They were all doctored and fed and housed and pampered in the most delightful and satisfactory fashion. A large house was given up to Thor and his company. Boats and rowers were put in their service, and crowds sat outside and sang songs all day, or cheered if any dwarf showed so much of his nose. Some of the songs were old ones, but some of them were quite new and spoke confidently of the sudden death of the dragon, and the cargoes of rich presents coming down to the river to Lake Town. These were inspired largely by the master, and they not particularly pleased the dwarves, but in the meantime they were well contented, and grew fat and strong again. Indeed, within a week they were quite recovered, fitted out in fine cloths of their proper colours, with beards combed and trimmed, and proud steps. Thorin looked and walked as if his kingdom was already regained, and Smaug chopped up into little bits. Then, as he had said, the dwarf's good feelings towards the little hobbit grew stronger every day. There were no more groans or grungles. They drank his health, and patted him on the back, and made a great fuss of him, which was just as well, for he was not feeling particularly cheerful. He had not forgotten Look the Mountain, nor the thought of the dragon, and he had been beside a shocking cold. For 3 days he sneezed and coughed, but he could not go out, even after his speeches at banquets were limited to, "Thank you very much." In the meanwhile, the wood elves had gone back up into the forest river with their cargoes, and there was great excitement in the king's palace. I have never heard what happened to the chief of the guards and the butler. Nothing, of course, was ever said about the keys or the barrels, while the dwarves stayed in Lake Town, and Bilbo was very careful never to become invisible. Still, I dare say, more guessed than was known, with doubtless Mr. Baggins remained such of a mystery. In any case, the king now knew the dwarf's errand, or thought he did, and said to himself, we'll see. No treasure shall come back through Mirkwood without having something to say in my having something to say in the matter. But I expect they will all come to a bad end, and serve them right." He, at any rate, not believes in dwarves fighting and killing dragons like Smaug, and he strongly suspected attempted burglary or something like it, which shows he was quite a wise elf, and wiser than the men of the town, though he was not quite right, as he will see in the end. He sent out his spies among the shores of the lake, and as far northward as the mountains as they would go, and waited. At the end of a fortnight, Thorin began to think of departure. While the enthusiasm still lasted in the town, was the time to get help. It would not do to let everything cool down with delay, so he spoke to the master and his counselors, and said soon his company must go to the mountain. Then, for the first time, the master was surprised and a little frightened, and wondered if Thorin was, after all, really a descendant of the old kings. He had never thought the dwarves would actually dare approach Smaug, but he believed they were frauds who would sooner or later be discovered and turned out. He was wrong. Thorin, of course, was really the grandson of the king of the mountain, and there was no knowing what a dwarf will not dare and do for revenge or the recovery of his own. But the master was not sorry at all to let them go. They were expensive to keep, and their arrival had turned things into a long holiday in which business was at a standstill. "Let them go and bother old Smaug, and let them see how he welcomes them," he thought. "Certainly, O Thorin, Thrain's son, Thoror's son," was what he said. "You must claim what you own. The hour is at hand, spoken of old. What help we can offer shall be yours, and trust that your gratitude when your kingdom is regained." So one day, with autumn now getting far on, and winds were cold, and leaves were falling fast, 3 large boats left Lake Town, laden with rowers, dwarves, Mr. Baggins, and many provisions. Horses and ponies had been sent round by circuitous paths to meet them at their appointed landing place. The master and his counselors bade them farewell from the grand steps of the town hall that went down toward the lake. People sang on quays and out of windows, the white oars dipped and splashed, and all they went north up the lake on the last stage of their long journey. The only person thoroughly unhappy, though, was Bilbo.